Hello and welcome to another How to Code Well web chat. My name is Peter Fisher. Today we're going to be talking about cutting corners in web development. This is something that everyone does, regardless of whether they admit it or not. Everyone cuts corners in web development. Now, in my opinion, there are some corners that are acceptable to be cut, and there are some corners that are just not acceptable to be cut. I'm going to be talking about those two things, and I'm also going to be talking about that from a freelancer's perspective as well. Because when you're a freelancer, you have to get the project out in the agreed time frame, right? And to a requirement that has been defined by you and the client. And you need to do it in such a way that there is a level of communication between you and the client which is transparent. They know exactly what you're doing and you're not doing, okay? And that's where the corners can get cut, right? Just to make things quicker and easier. So anyway, let's talk about corners that should never be cut in web development first, regardless of whether you're a freelancer or what. First of all, I want to make a point about putting on notices in PHP. When you're in development mode, and it doesn't need to be PHP, it could be any programming language, anything that you're building your application in. Often you have these error reporting levels, okay? Obviously, in production, you don't have error reporting on because you don't, you don't want to display those errors to the general public. Obviously, you have them on in a sort of a hidden way, so you still get notified of the errors. But when you're in development, when you're actually producing the thing on your local machine and you're developing the application, you must have error reporting on and displayed. You mustn't think, oh, PHP can just handle or Python can just handle that error message. Yes, we'll get a notice in the log, but we'll just forget about it. That's the thing. You cannot bury your head in the sand because you might think, oh, well, I can just bury my head in the sand and someone else can deal with it later on. That is an extremely lazy attitude to have. And you're not going to improve yourself as a developer because you're not going to be aware of the notices and the issues that your buggy code has. And at the end of the day, that is the case. The code that you're producing is buggy because it's coming out with all these notices. So that you just shouldn't do. You shouldn't turn off error reporting on whatever language that you're doing. That is a big no-no. Testing. Let's talk now about testing. So yes, we should all test our work, and yes, we should all have a pipeline in place where when we push to production, there is a level of testing that goes out, that gets ran, and we get some feedback off of that, and perhaps we go a little bit further and get some code coverage and maybe some statistical analysis on the actual code. That is obviously a very good thing to do. Now, you can take testing to the absolute nth degree and test every little thing, everything in your application. You can do functional tests, unit tests, integration tests, all of those kind of things in an automated way, and that is fantastic. However, you need to choose between what it is that you're going to test and what it isn't you're going to test, because in a normal world, you're not going to have the time, especially as a freelancer, to test every little thing unless that is part of the accepted requirements in your application. Now, believe you me, that normally isn't the case, okay? You need to have enough testing to give yourself confidence and the client confidence that when the next release comes out, bugs won't be introduced and the application will be stable. But that doesn't mean that you have to test every little thing. It doesn't mean that you have to lift up every rock and have a look underneath each thing. And that you need to address, that you need to be aware of what it is that you are testing and what it is that you're not testing. Obviously, like I said, you want to be, your ideal world wants to be 100% code coverage. But that just isn't a reality. That isn't the case. Especially as a freelancer, you can't do that. Especially if your team is very small, you can't do that either. So the point here is just to be aware of the actual things that are risky, okay, and test those first. So don't go, okay, we've got We want to try and hit 100% code coverage. So what we're going to do is focus on the low-hanging fruit first, right? The easy stuff to test. Because believe you me, by the time you get to about, 70, 80%, the last 20% is going to be the worst stuff, hardest stuff to test. Ideally, you want to be focusing on that first because that's the risky stuff. That's the stuff that breaks. If there's an issue with that, there's an issue with probably most things. You want to be focusing on that first. Don't waste your time just testing things that are, like I said, low-hanging fruit, the easy things to test, just because you're focusing on a code coverage report, all right? You shouldn't go to a client and say, oh, yeah, like last month we tested 50% of the stuff. Now we're at 80% of the stuff. And they'll be like, oh, that's great. Wow, that's brilliant. But what they don't know is that the last 20% is the actual proper core of the application, and that is very tricky. So when you're cutting corners with testing, make sure that you are cutting the corner that is the low-hanging fruit, the easy stuff to test. Don't you focus on the stuff that is difficult. Focus on the stuff that is going to screw up your application if it goes wrong. That is the I'd rather have 20% code coverage on the focusing on the most difficult stuff than 80% of all the other bits and pieces that just don't matter. All the easy stuff to test. You can get someone to do that for you. That's not an issue. And also, it's very nice, and I think I've mentioned this before, that when you come to the end of your sprint, that you've got some easy stuff to work on, right? So you focus on the difficult stuff first, right? You attack that first because that's the more rewarding bits and pieces. And also, just focusing on testing a little bit more, what I find is that the tests will change the code, okay? Because what you do is when you realize that things aren't very easy to test, you start thinking, I need to refactor this code. So that brings on code change and churn. All right. So yeah. Anyway, I've spoken enough about testing. Other areas of cutting corners in web development, we can focus on code reviews. Okay. So code reviews are very important. So sharing your code to other developers, making them aware of what you're doing and what they're doing, and getting some sort of buy-in from them to review your code. If you have the opportunity to do that, and not everyone does, but if you have the opportunity to do that, please persevere in that, because it's bringing everyone's ability up. And it also means that the knowledge is being shared amongst the team. Other areas of cutting corners is commit messages, okay? So don't just have a bunch of commit messages that just says updates, right? Because that's useless. That's absolutely pointless. If someone's going and reviewing your code coverage, they might be going through your commit messages as well. It's basically like a story of your application, all right? The story of how your application developed and evolved, and that should describe exactly what it is in that commit, okay? Don't just put in updates, because that's pointless and useless, and there is literally no point in doing that. It's not giving anyone any benefit. Actually, it's sort of a guarded thing. Whenever I see commits that just says updates, it's like, oh yeah, so what, you've just had updates as a text, but you've updated 50 files. What have you been up to? That kind of thing. It sparks off a level of suspicion. So that is another area. Okay, code commits, commit messages. Another one, documentation. All right. So it's not only you working on the application. That is the first rule. Even if it is just you working on the application at first, you don't know if the company that you're working for is going to hire someone out in 3 months' time. Also, you're going to forget what you did in 3 months' time. You're going to forget how you do it. For example, let's say you buy another laptop, all right, and you have to install all of the bits and pieces again. If you don't have any documentation, then you're going to be screwed, because you're going to forget how to do stuff. You're going to be forgetting what and you'll be like, why does this application not run locally anymore on this machine? And it's because you don't have any documentation to refer to. So documentation is a huge key. So even if, I do this when I'm as a freelancer, I don't charge for like the hours I spend documenting my work for my own personal use, because I do have multiple machines here, and I need to be able to synchronize these things. So when I'm working in the office, I use this iMac. Whenever I'm out and about, I use my MacBook Pro. So I need to have sort of a repository of documentation that I can refer to for my own sanity, right? But when you're in bigger teams, you need to have documentation there, especially with deployment, especially with production and stuff like that, because you want to have knowledge sharing, all right? So code corners to cut. There really isn't a lot that I can say are a good corners to cut. Perhaps there are some elements of testing which are good, but I keep seeing all sorts of tweets and all sorts of things on the internet where some poor developer has had to deal with someone else's rubbish because they've cut corners. Don't be that programmer. Try not to cut as many corners as you can. It won't make your client's life easier, and it's not going to make your life easier in the long run. If you haven't done so already, do subscribe, because I do a web chat like this every week, as well as a lot of web development tutorials as well. Happy coding, everyone, and I will speak to you again soon. Cheers. Bye.